Very excited to be hosting this program this evening, and very excited to have you all with us. I'd also like to say thank you to all of our invited speakers for your time and your ideas. We're excited to have you here, and yeah, very lucky to bring us all together in this virtual space this evening. I'd also like to recognize the support of the Michigan State University Federal Credit Union, who supported the exhibition Seeds of Resistance, which this program is being presented in conjunction with, and also the MSU Science Fest, which is, this program takes place as a part of the Science Festival, and we're happy to be partnering with them for this event and others throughout the month of April here at Michigan State University. So tonight, we are going to have a range of different, there'll be a number of different steps to this conversation. I'm going to start by presenting a little bit of an introduction to the Seeds of Resistance exhibition that's currently on view at the museum. And then we're going to go through a round of lightning talks by our invited speakers, where they will introduce themselves, their work, and offer some ideas that will surely be related to the exhibition and its main themes. Then with the remaining time, we'll do some moderated discussions and then open it up for a question and answer with the audience. So at that point, we will ask if anyone in the audience is interested and willing to offer your question, you can unmute and speak directly to our participants, or you can drop your questions directly into the chat, and that's perfectly fine. The program this evening will be recorded, so everyone is aware, and there's also live captioning, I believe, is available. Let me double check that that's true. Yes, there is live captioning available. At the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon that says live transcript. So for anyone that would like to use that, that service is certainly available. As we start here this evening, I also want to acknowledge the recent events, and specifically the ongoing racial injustice, issues of police brutality, and the killing of Black and Brown and other people of color in this country. In the wake of the Derek Chauvin trial, while the subject may not be picked up here directly in our conversation this evening, it is important, I think, that we recognize the connection between racial and social justice and issues of environmental health and justice. And certainly the very notion of Seeds of Resistance certainly intends to draw out the need for this kind of intersectional and interdisciplinary thinking. Then, as we are coming together from different locations in this shared virtual space this evening, it is perhaps all the more important to acknowledge that the Seeds of Resistance exhibition is sited at the MSU Bird Art Museum, which itself is situated on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. The museum and Michigan State University reside on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. This statement is an acknowledgement of the ongoing systemic erasure of Indigenous people perpetuated by the U.S. state. As we open this program, I invite you to consider what histories have brought you to the space you currently inhabit, currently inhabit or occupy, and how these histories may also come to bear on considerations of art, scientific inquiry, and the protection of land, water, seeds, and the great diversity of life on Earth. Occasionally, you'll hear me ask my colleague Katie to advance the slides. You may hear our participants also do the same. Katie is my colleague who's assisting this evening. So Katie, if you wouldn't mind, please. Next slide. Next slide. So for those of you that haven't been to the exhibition, welcome. I'll offer some views and just give a little bit of an introduction. The exhibition, Seeds of Resistance, currently on view at the museum and up through July 18th, brings together 12 artists living and working today who are specifically engaged in conversations around biodiversity, environmental health and justice, and the planting of seeds in both literal and figurative terms. Today, we are also joined by 3 of those artists, Claire Pentecost, Beatriz Cortez, and Dornith Doherty, and I'm grateful to have them here with us this evening. At the core of the exhibition is the idea that seeds are these amazing archives, not only of genetic information, but also of human cultural values and histories. And so with the loss and the threat to seeds and plants and biodiversity on Earth, we also stand to lose knowledge of ourselves and our own histories. Next slide, Katie. And next slide. As is evidenced in these images of the exhibition, the galleries of the museum themselves become a kind of ecosystem of both art and ideas, each contributing meaningfully to a larger whole. This acknowledgement of interconnectedness is another key point for the exhibition. Next slide. And next slide, Katie. I also want to acknowledge that many of the scientists and other MSU researchers and faculty members joining us this evening were very involved in this exhibition, contributing their own ideas, informing me of their research and lending their voice to the exhibition. And I'm happy to also to have them also this evening to share their additional thoughts and views on the exhibition and their work as it relates to these ideas. And next slide, Katie. And one more. And one more, sorry. I forgot how many slides I put in here. Finally, it's important to note the connection between the exhibition and MSU's own history as the first land-grant university in the US, with agriculture and the study of the environment as key elements of the institution's DNA. And here I'd like to mention the work of former MSU professor William J. Beal, which you see here featured in this photograph, whose longstanding experiment known as the Beal Seed Viability Experiment, which is now 141 years in the making, is also a point of interest in the exhibition. And I'm sure that this will be picked up later on in the conversation. So with that view, next slide, please, Katie. Some more archival images of the dig, of the seed experiment. And now I'm going to introduce the next slide, our first speaker this evening, Beatriz Cortez. Beatriz is a multidisciplinary artist based in Los Angeles. Her work explores simultaneity, life in different temporalities, and versions of modernity via untimely and speculative imaginaries of the future. She has had numerous solo exhibitions and has participated in group exhibitions nationally and internationally. She has exhibited her work at the Rockefeller Center in New York, the Whitney Museum in New York, Hammer Museum, Los Angeles, Bank Mob Society, Shanghai, China, Centro Cultural Metropolitano, Quito, Ecuador, and Craft Contemporary Museum, Los Angeles, among others. Cortez has received numerous awards, including the Longenecker Roth Artist Residence at UCSD, Artadia Los Angeles Award, Freeze Lifewater Inaugural Sculptural Prize, the Rima Horton Mann Foundation Emerging Artist Grant, and California Community Foundation Fellowship for Visual Artists, among others. She holds an MFA from the California Institute of the Arts and a doctorate from Arizona State University. She teaches in the Department of Central American and Transborder Studies at California State University, Northridge. So everyone, please welcome and thank Beatriz Cortez for being here this evening.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Stephen Bridges and the MSU Art Museum for bringing together Science Fest and the Seeds of Resistance exhibition, and for inviting me to participate in this interdisciplinary panel. It is such a great pleasure to share this space with all of you today. 3 concepts are central to my work. Time, could I have the next slide, please? Time, simultaneity, and movement. And I am interested in how issues such as race, class, migration, and gender cut through those concepts. In order to move through space and time, and to explore simultaneities, the ability to intervene in the chronological order of time has gained importance in my work. I strive to question the imposition of humanism, liberalism, the Enlightenment as the only way, the colonial way to understand reason, and with it to understand time. Instead, I'm interested in circular, oftentimes indigenous conceptual constructions of time, multiplicity, simultaneity. Even as I work with industrial steel, I imagine returning this industrial material that has been artificially extracted from the earth back to the land. Building rocks with steel is an example of that gesture. However, it is through my work with plants that I have understood that our mark on this planet is not only written on the sedimentation layers or on the rock, but also on the living environment. After all, a garden is an artificial arrangement of plants, a form of human intervention with cultural and historical content. Plants have allowed me to build metaphors about eugenics, about labor, migration, hybridity, ancient knowledge, and others. I began to explore the idea that humans are not necessary for memory to exist, that it is possible to think of a post-human memory, a non-human memory, for instance, the memory of plants. Next slide, please. And I began to think of plants and gardens as nomadic beings. I created Nomad 13, a collaboration with Los Angeles-based artist Rafa Esparza, a sculpture made in the shape of a space capsule, a cosmic garden that preserved the knowledge and culture of ancient peoples in the Americas for the survival and pleasure of humans of the future. Inspired by ideas about nomadism and by Veggie, a garden project that NASA was at the time nurturing at the International Space Station, we imagined this work as a nomadic garden in orbit. And through it, we imagined Earth as a nomadic garden in orbit. And we imagined ancient forms of indigenous knowledge and technologies represented by the very existence of these plants as symbols of the survival of ancient cultures and their participation in the construction of the future. During our participation at the Salón Nacional in Bogotá, Rafa and I shared our blueprints for our space capsule garden with the public, and more recently, until May 14, they are on view as part of a virtual exhibition titled Cruising the Horizon at the Latinx Project site in New York University. This effort to share our plans for the garden space capsule counters the colonial idea of the race to conquer space. Instead, our space capsule carries with it a gift that all of us inherited from ancient indigenous peoples of the Americas, the seeds of edible plants that the Spanish conquerors attempted to ban, but that were secretly and at great risk kept alive by indigenous communities and passed down from generation to generation. Next slide, please. Through my work, I approach plants as builders, designers, creators. They create atmospheres that we need to live, but that also make white supremacy impossible because these atmospheres carry within them, as Emanuele Coccia argues, the infinite mixture of all things past, present, and future. And so that to breathe is, and I quote, to embrace in one's own breath all the matter of the world, end of quote. Therefore, Generosity 1, the work that you see here, is my work on view in Seeds of Resistance, carries with it a gift of generosity from ancient times towards the future. It includes ancient forms of knowledge and technology, nurturing foods and medicinal plants, spiritual contents, and the impossibility of white supremacy because it is a gift founded on the porosity of all bodies, the flow of atmospheres, and our connection with others whom we will never get to meet. Final slide, please. Plants are survivors of repression, prohibition, colonization, slavery, capitalism, imperialism, eugenics, and genetic experimentation. They have survived reminding us of the porosity of their bodies and the futility of borders. Also, plants leave evidence of our migrations as the natural condition of the planet. And I would like to think that in our absence, they will remain latent, preserving future life and the memory of colonialism, racism, and migration, circulating our mixed matter, the remnants of our existence, but also preserving the memory of our generosity and the courage to survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatriz. That was amazing. I'm gonna hold comments, until the end of the lightning talk round, but I appreciate all your comments. Thank you very much. The next presenter is Krista Issacs. Krista Issacs is an assistant professor of international seed systems in the Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences. As an interdisciplinary scientist, her scholarly work in seed systems blends gender studies and agroecology to analyze social inequities in agriculture and understand the needs of marginalized producers in order to generate processes that increase food and seed sovereignty. She has worked with producers in India, Mali, and in East Africa on various crops, including sorghum, rice, wheat, sweet potatoes, and beans. And with that, I welcome Krista Issacs.
Thank you for the invitation to participate today, and as well as in the exhibition, and bringing us all together in this virtual space. Seeds mean so many things to different people, and at their most fundamental, they are the roots of our modern existence, and they're as basic as water, air, and sunlight. Just like water in the past century, seeds have become highly commoditized. No doubt air and sunlight will follow. Next slide, please. When I hear seeds of resistance, I immediately think of the Mexican proverb that arose out of social injustice, political, and economic strife. Quisieran enterrarnos, pero no sabían éramos semillas. They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. Take a moment and think about what that means to you. We plant seeds to produce food, textiles, and flowers. Seeds plant themselves to generate the incredible natural diversity that exists on Earth. We plant seeds of thought, growth, and yes, resistance in our students, children's, and others' minds. Seeds are cultural knowledge, and as explored in this exhibition, they are also the hope of the future. And as such, we must ensure that they are available and free to all. Here at MSU, I do research with small farmers in regions of Africa and India on agricultural seed systems, gender, and farmer knowledge. Basically, the goal is to ensure farmers have the seeds they want, when they want them, and with the growing and processing traits that are important to them. This work considers how knowledge about seed and variety traits is shared, and how different intersecting identities like culture, race, education, and other aspects of gender shape this knowledge. Understanding context and working with farmers helps ensure that the science is relevant to the end users, which hopefully leads to adoption of new preferred varieties that are high yielding, that increase food security, and increase access to seeds for all. Next slide, please. So what does this actually look like in practice? In Mali, men and women farmers have a rich knowledge of sorghum varieties and the traits adapted to their environments and traditional foods. We conducted culinary tests in villages and found that women evaluate varieties in terms of the available food after processing. Varieties with high amounts of bran are less valued because bran isn't used for food. Farmers value tall varieties because they are out of reach of livestock, and they value drooping, bouncing panicles because the birds can't rest on them and the rain drips off, preventing disease mold complexes. This type of information is now being used by plant breeders to develop appropriate varieties. Next slide. In Uttar Pradesh, India, I've worked with a network of over 2 million women in micro-saving self-help groups. Prior to this project, households access grain, in other words, not seed, from the local market for planting. Women rarely left the house and made few agricultural production decisions. Through the project, women in the self-help groups were trained in compost and seed production, and within 2 years, they were selling and bartering their own seed, and they were known throughout their villages and beyond for the quality of their seed. This integrated project that included sensitization on women's rights and empowerment, in combination with increasing their capacity to earn money and contribute their knowledge to the household, has led to an incredible personal transformation for these women. Next slide. In Rwanda, farmers value crop diversity, traditionally growing many different food crops and maintaining diverse seeds. These driving mixtures on this slide are composed by women farmers intentionally, with anywhere from 3 to 10 different varieties. Small-scale farmers value crop and genetic diversity to minimize risk. In the event of poor weather, disease, or pest outbreaks, this diversity offers a form of insurance against complete crop loss. Yet our food chains and dominant agricultural models demand uniformity in varieties, limit the diversity of food available, and reduce our agricultural resilience. Next slide, please. Speaking of diversity and resilience, I present one last aspect of our research on minor crops, which are species that have been neglected by traditional or conventional breeding efforts and have great potential in a changing climate. These crops are often fall in the category of superfoods like amaranth or quinoa and turmeric that are now becoming popular in the United States. They are highly nutritious, and not surprisingly, farmers have been cultivating them for thousands of years. The stewards of these crops should be the ones that benefit from their rise in value, yet this rarely happens. As seeds continue to be commoditized and appropriated by large corporations, so too is this agricultural heritage and knowledge. In my lab group, we are researching ways to ensure cultivators of minor crops like Clonio, pictured here, maintain the rights of their seeds, heritage, and are the leaders in designing new markets and hopefully new food systems. Quisieran enterrarnos, pero no sabían éramos semillas. They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. But what if they take away our seeds? Then what will we do? Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. We appreciate that very much. Next up is David Lowry. David Lowry is a plant evolutionary biologist and associate professor in the MSU Department of Plant Biology. Dr. Lowry's research is focused on understanding how evolutionary adaptation occurs in plants, how those adaptations contribute to the evolution of new species, and how we can leverage those adaptations to improve agricultural crops. Research in his lab is focused on 3 groups of plants: monkey flowers for understanding principles of evolution, switchgrass for the biofuels and bioproducts, and common bean for food security. With that, please welcome David Lowry.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for inviting me here today, and thank you all for coming. It's really great to be part of this. As a scientist, we don't often get to be on a panel with artists, and we probably should be more often, and this is really great. So the research that goes on in my lab is to understand how plants adapt to different environments, and specifically how different environmental stresses impact plants, and how those plants have genetic changes that change over time that lead to adaptations that allow them to survive into the future. So you can advance the slide. So a lot of the research in my lab is focused on this yellow monkey flower, which lives in the Western United States. And I've been working on it since graduate school days back in 2005. And I'm very interested in how it adapts to different environmental conditions. We study this monkey flower because it's been able to adapt from the coastlines of California all the way to the highest mountains in the Western United States. It lives on the hot springs in Yellowstone National Park. It can survive on serpentine soils, which are these rocks that are toxic and also contain the wrong ratio of calcium and magnesium. In addition, we find this plant living on places that are inhospitable to most other plant species. So for example, mine tailings in California. So there was a large copper mine in California in the town of Copperopolis, which was the largest mine in the 1860s and 70s, probably in the world, and has sort of a violent past where it supplied a lot of the copper for the Union Army during the Civil War. When they left, when the mine shut down, there was mine tailings left all over the place, and it's a super fun site now. But this plant has been able to adapt to live on those mine tailings. And so I'm very curious about the different ways that plants adapt to these various environmental conditions that are highly stressful, and what genetic changes are necessary to allow them to adapt. Okay, next slide. So all of that research is pretty fundamental in its nature. But when I finished graduate school, I was very interested in how we might be able to apply our understanding of adaptation to something that was more useful for humanity. And so I got interested in this plant switchgrass, which grows across all of the eastern United States. So it was this large prairie grass that the buffaloes ate and lived, was a major part of the tall grass prairie system. And it mostly got killed off by agriculture. When agriculture came in and we plowed up all the old prairies, all that was left was remnants of the switchgrass in streams and in remnant prairies. But now we're looking at switchgrass as a potential source of bioenergy or bioproducts. And I think that there's a great potential here to replace a lot of the corn production in the Midwest with this native plant that actually fixes carbon in the soil because it has long roots, and it actually has a much higher biodiversity that lives on in terms of insects and other life and birds. So right here is a field that we have in Western Michigan, where we have the diversity from across the Eastern United States planted in this panel, We call it our diversity panel, and this is a drone photo of that. And we actually have this panel planted all the way, the same exact plants planted from Michigan all the way to central Mexico. And so in 16 different locations. And in that way, we can understand how this plant has adapted to different parts of the continent of North America. Okay, next slide. More recently, my research has shifted towards trying to understand resilience in general with plants. And I've been part of this new Resilience Institute at Michigan State University. It's the Plant Resilience Institute. And a lot of our focus is understanding how plants are going to be able to cope with climate change. So we all have the plants that we love and that are part of our agricultural food systems and are part of our everyday lives. But with climate change, they will likely not be able to grow where they are right now without some kind of alteration. Either we'll shift things through migration, or the plants will have to be altered in some way. And so one of the things that we focused on in my lab is on common bean, which we heard from Krista about this. And common bean is an amazing crop that is the leading source of protein, vegetable-based protein in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And so it's extremely important for food security worldwide. But the problem with common bean is that it's highly heat sensitive. And so as global temperatures increase and nighttime temperatures increase, the first thing that happens is that these plants actually lose fertility. So they lose male fertility and the pollen goes sterile. And as a result, you don't produce any beans. And so this is happening in places like Nicaragua already, where we're losing the crops that are local that are being grown there. So we've been very interested in understanding how different varieties can actually be more heat tolerant, and then hoping to be able to mix that in with other varieties in order to improve heat tolerance worldwide. And of course, this runs into all kinds of issues when you think about it, but I think this is going to be necessary if we're going to keep bean production going in these areas where it's so important. I guess the final thing I'll say is that the exhibition itself was based on the Beal seed experiment, or at least partially based on the Beal seed experiment, which myself and some of my colleagues dug up last Thursday. I think Marjorie Weber is on the call and was the one that actually pulled the bottle out of the ground. And I have the bottle right here just to show everybody, but it's just a very simple bottle that Beal planted 141 years ago into the soil upside down like this. It contained over 1,000 seeds from 23 different species. And every 20 years, we now dig it up out of the ground, or one of the bottles up out of the ground, shake out the contents and see how many seeds still germinate. And the experiment's ongoing right now. Nothing's germinated yet. And so we're still waiting to see what will happen this time around. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that, and the insights on the experiment too. All right, Claire, you're next, and I'll introduce Claire Pentecost. Claire Pentecost is an artist and writer whose poetic and inductive drawings, sculpture, and installations test and celebrate the conditions that bound and define life itself. Her projects often address the contested line between the natural and the artificial, focusing for many years on food, agriculture, bioengineering, and anthropogenic changes in the indivisible living entity that animates our planet. Since 2006, she has worked with Brian Holmes, 16 Beaver, and many others organizing Continental Drift, a series of seminars to articulate the interlocking scales of our existence and the logic of globalization. She is also a founding member of Deep Time Chicago, dedicated to cultural change in the Anthropocene. A sample of Pentecost exhibition venues include Documenta 13, Whitechapel Gallery, the 13th Istanbul Biennial, Nottingham Contemporary, the DePaul Art Museum, the 3rd Mongolian Land Art Biennial, Sursak Museum in Beirut, and the Times Museum in Guangzhou. Institutions inviting her to lecture include MIT, Cal Arts, RISD, Northwestern University, Rice University, the University of Virginia, Creative Time Summit, and many others. And I'll add Michigan State University to that list if you don't mind, Claire. She is represented by Higher Pictures New York and is a professor in the Department of Photography at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So let's welcome Claire Pentecost.
Hi. Hi, thank you, Stephen. And thank you for all the presentations so far. Have been really exciting. I would like everyone to imagine their favorite plant or a favorite plant, a plant, just get a picture in your mind, maybe a tree or a field of irises. Okay, how many of you imagine the part that lives underground? The root system. We often don't think about what goes on underground, but this has been the direction of my research for the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years, is looking at soil. And so that is my entry to the seed, because I was very influenced by this idea that many have articulated, but I read it first by the anthropologist Gregory Bateson. And the idea is that it's often thought that the unit of survival in evolution is like the gene or the individual or the family line, but actually the unit of survival is organism plus environment. So, and he says, of course, we're learning bitterly that the organism that poisons its environment is out of luck. So we don't just preserve seeds, we have to preserve their substrate and that which gives them life. So I'll take the next slide. This is an example of many parts of a project I did called Soil Erg. And this is what's showing in the broad. So I thought I would talk about it. What I did in this project was to propose soil as the basis for a new economy, which really interested me as a thought experiment. Like our economy truly valuable in repeating. Next slide, please. Could I have the next slide, please, Katie? Aha. Okay, so I made about 80 or 100, no, back one, please. 80 or 100 soil ingots to represent this unit of value. And I called it Soil Erg because it's made simply of soil and work, because you have to make them. But anyone can make soil. So I love this idea that people, that you could make this central element of an economy. And I displayed them on these gold leafed panels of glass so that you would look at them and see the gold and the ingot shape, but the ground and the gold are reversed. So the gold is merely to show off the thing of real value, which is soil. And if you would go back a slide, please. Thank you. This, I've made about 50 drawings that are proposals for notes, for money notes, like bills. And on them, I put portraits of people who have helped us understand the humans in the broader ecology. And many of the creatures in the soil food web. This particular one is, some of you may recognize Vandana Shiva, the activist from India, who's done a lot of work in preserving seeds and fighting for their independence from multinationals. Next slide, please, and then you can advance it to the next one. Yeah, this was an event I organized, which is in Germany, which was a Compost Congress, where we invited a number of organic farmers from Germany and Austria to come and bring samples of their compost They tested all the compost, they tasted them, they made notes, we spent a whole day talking about it. They even put together a manifesto for soil because, for compost, because in Germany, they have composting system that, everyone puts their organic waste out and is collected, and they have compost factories, and the farmers, and they're using a lot of it for biofuels, and the farmers are concerned that they need the compost for mending and restoring soils. One more slide. This project is called Proposal for a New American Agriculture. I'm identifying the American system of agriculture with the industrial system, which has been exported around the world. So what I did was I took a 5-foot by 9-foot cotton American flag and I composted it with worms, suggesting, because if you want to grow food without chemicals, the secret is nurturing the soil. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Claire. Unfortunately, I believe one of our speakers this evening, actually Shade, is unable to be here, so we're going to move on to Dornith Doherty. Sorry, Dornith.
No, go ahead.
I'll introduce him now.
Okay.
A 2012 Guggenheim Foundation Fellow, Dornith Doherty is a U.S. artist working primarily with photography, video, and scientific imaging. Among her chief concerns is to actively visualize the philosophical, cultural, and ecological questions that are often left invisible when considering human entanglement in our rapidly changing environment. Doherty was born in Houston, Texas, and received a BA from Rice University and an MFA in photography from Yale University. She currently resides in Southlake and is Distinguished Research Professor at the University of North Texas, where she has been on the faculty since 1996. In addition to the Guggenheim Fellowship, she has received grants from the Fulbright Foundation, the Japan Foundation, the Indiana Arts Commission, the United States Department of the Interior, the University of North Texas, and the Houston Center for Photography. She has been an artist in residence at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Toronto, Ontario's Science Center, the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies, and Joshua Tree National Park. She has received the Honored Educator Award from the Society of Photographic Education's South Central Conference in 2012, and more recently, the Texas Legislature named her 2016 Texas State Artist in the 2D genre. Okay, welcome, Dornith. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Stephen. And Katie, will you go ahead and switch the slide? This is, I'm so honored to be in this exhibition and to be on this panel because it's so interesting. And it's, if you were to draw a Venn diagram of my interests and the panelists' talks today, it'd be 100% match. There would be no Venn diagram, it'd just be a circle. So thank you for such a great curation of the show and the experiences to go with it. So the work in this exhibition is from a long-term project that I call Archiving Eden. And it was inspired by the opening of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, located on an island only 600 miles from the North Pole. And so that opened, the Svalbard Vault opened in 2008. So this remote and secure seed bank is buried deep inside a mountain so tall that if both polar ice caps melt, the collection of seeds will remain safe. And when I read that a modern day Noah's Ark had been, for plants had been built, I immediately wanted to photograph it. I was inspired by this kind of simultaneously dystopian and utopian aspects of this project, where on one hand you have scientists and volunteers and institutions from around the world that were organized by a guy who devoted 35 years of his life to make it happen. And they're coming together to build the first truly global botanical backup system. But on the other hand, you have the gravity of climate change and political instability that kind of created a need for an inaccessible vault and fortified vault that's, off on an island by itself. It's often called the Doomsday Vault. So Katie, will you do the next slide? So in the time between my first impulse to record this fallout vault and now Archiving Eden expanded into a wide-ranging expeditionary project that explored almost 20 national seed banks on 5 continents, from Brazil to Australia to Russia. So this image is from the collection of soy seeds at the Russian National Bank in Kuban province. So David, when you were showing that bottle, I have had so many conversations about what is the proper way to store seeds with these seed scientists around the world. And they all smack talk each other about, whether it should be astronaut packets or glass bottles. And so I'm really interested to see that there was no top on Dr. Beal's experiment, that it was just sand and it was left open. That's just so different from how it's done in the scientific community right now. So both literally and figuratively, seed banks conserve seeds or clones and then try to stop time to prevent the materials from changing farther. And as I've photographed this constant agonizing quest to preserve the spark of life in these tiny vulnerable seeds, I really became fascinated by the philosophical and economic and social and political issues that that surrounded the role of human agency in relation to gene banking. But also the poetic questions about the extension of time and, as Beatriz said, the different types of time that you encounter in seed banks, where you're simultaneously in the future and the past while you're looking at these seeds. So next slide, please. So these kind of questions that I encountered and my conversations as I traveled led me to collaboration with research biologists at the seed banks, who allowed me to use their on-site X-ray machines, usually used for statistical analysis about seed viability, to make images of the seeds. So I was making images of the seeds, plantlets, and clones. So the scientists have been invaluable collaborators, not only for sharing their research and with me and providing access to these high security spaces and rare specimens, but also through longer term collaborations, which sometimes included their growing seeds for me to X-ray. So Archiving Eden, this project has 2 parts. And the photographs of the spaces and technological interventions required to store seeds in a state of suspended animation, and digital collages made from X-rays of materials safeguarded in the banks. And this particular aspect of the project is not on view. The work in the show focuses on the documentary images of the spaces involved in seed banking and the technology. So these the X-ray collages are presented in several different ways, including works on paper. I made a really big installation at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Toronto, in collaboration with the Ontario Science Centre, lenticular prints or animations and videos. This one is presented as a lenticular work. So when you walk by, it changes color from green to blue, which for me was inspired by the kind of cryogenic process where you would take something that was living and try to freeze it, but also the inability of trying to stop time in living materials, which is important, we all want to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Dornith. All right, our last speaker, our last lightning talk for this evening is Peter Carrington. Peter was born in Toronto, Ontario, but as he grew up, his family moved further and further west, with him finally starting school and spending his childhood in St. Joseph, Michigan. From his earliest years, Peter was an avid insect collector, joining the Michigan Entomological Society in the 7th grade and dedicating himself to studying silverfish and their relatives. The family moved to East Grand Rapids for his high school years, and it was there that he started his first experiments in science illustration and art. In 1967, he began his undergraduate career at Michigan State University, finally graduating in 1992 in zoology, although by then he was already 20 years into a career in biological and medical illustration. Peter has now moved on from his 35-year career in science illustration and science writing and earned a PhD in the Department of Plant Biology, researching an ancient extinct Native American crop cultivar. He retired in 2013 from his 36-year career as instructor of edible and toxic plants and wilderness survival techniques at Lansing Community College. In 2008, he became assistant curator at the W.J. Beal Botanical Garden, ultimately becoming curator in 2018, specializing in edible and toxic plants for people and animals. He is a consultant to the Regional Poison Control Center and to several zoos concerning plantings and food plants, and teaches toxic plants to vet school students. Thanks, Peter, and welcome.
Thank you very much. My research during my PhD research dealt with an edible, now partly extinct species of seed called Iva annua, also known as marsh elder. I actually heard about it on a documentary while I was washing dishes one Sunday. I was thinking I was so familiar with all the edible plants east of the Mississippi, and all of a sudden someone says, "Oh, these ancient cultures also ate marsh elder." I said, "What?" Anyway, there was a great mystery about this plant because these seeds were first discovered in rock shelters, natural cavities in sedimentary rock cliff sides overlooking the Illinois and Arkansas River. And when they were first found in caches inside these shelters, no one really had any idea what they were. No one had ever heard of anyone eating marsh elder or Iva. And in fact, even Melvin Gilmore, the famous ethno-paleobotanist from the University of Michigan, misidentified them the first time they were published. Turns out nobody actually even knew what they were for. Just because they had a cache of seeds didn't mean these people were eating these things. And some people thought that they probably wouldn't taste good or they didn't smell good or whatever. And that mystery was kind of put to rest during archaeological examination of the Mammoth Cave system. They found where people had gone in many, many miles into these cave systems, Native Americans, indigenous peoples who went in there probably to mine sulfate minerals. And of course, when you're miles back in these caves with just a torch for light, when you have to take a dump, you're probably not going to find a porta potty. And so these coprolites that were found back in the cave were almost 80% Iva seed. And so that kind of took away the idea that they were used for perfume or even medicine for that matter. The reason they were not able to identify these things was because no one had ever seen a seed from this plant that was on the order of 10 to 13 millimeters in length. The wild plant, it turns out, produces seeds in the 2 to 4 millimeter size. And so it took a while to even figure out what they were. And so there was a great mystery about these plants. Clearly, these people had developed through their indigenous cultures. They had developed seeds that were many times the size of the wild seed. And yet, even though they had lovingly cared for these things, it turns out maybe 2,500 years, no one in the present day was growing them. When you look at the European chroniclers who wrote down what Native Americans were using, no Native American historical tribes were still using this plant, or indeed even recognized that it was an edible plant.
Why is there this for everybody?
Do you have the next one? There we go. It turns out marsh elder is not extinct in the sense of a species. The wild antecedent populations are still thriving in North and Central America, at least down to about Campeche and Mexico. This is what the plant looks like. It's in the aster family. It's 3 to 6 feet tall. And it sort of comes in two separate styles. Style number one that you see here in my backyard, and style number two is an inhabitant of the salt marshes around the prairies of Kansas and Nebraska. It turns out that one of the confusion about this plant is that it was named by Linnaeus. And when he received the very first seeds of these things, apparently the labels got messed up and he thought some of them came from Peru. And so when they were discovered by Willdenow in North America, he figured these must be different. So he gave them the name Ciliata, and that's stuck until a revision of the genus by A.Y. Jackson. Anyway, these plants, these seeds, of course, we have the archaeological seeds to look at, but in order to do extensive studies on the nutrition, we have used modern populations. I was very fortunate to find a single plant in a salt marsh outside the Pfizer saline wetland in Nebraska, which had seeds that were almost 8 millimeters in length. And that would count in the archaeological world for having been under cultivation for more than 1,500 years. Iva was analyzed to see what kind of nutritional components it had by Ash and Ash back in 1978. And they found that it had a large amount of edible oil and a large amount of protein. But they actually only, and that would be something like 38% protein. They actually analyzed seed from only one population. So during my research and a chance to analyze seed from 9 different populations, I discovered protein levels between 40 and 60%. And that would make these some of the highest protein seeds ever domesticated by mankind. So why did they give these things up? Well, that's still a good question. My personal idea is that these were part of the Eastern agricultural complex, at least as deemed by archaeology. And these seeds, this suite of seeds was actually displaced partly by corn around the year 11 to 1300, something in there. And so there are many possible social reasons why this plant was discontinued, but we only have the wild versions of the wild populations now. And so go to the next slide if you would. Here we have a series of seeds that are much longer than the 2 to 3 millimeter seeds that most wild populations have. You can see they bear a superficial resemblance to sunflower seed, which are in the same family. And in fact, domesticated sunflower seed was part of the same complex of seed plants that comprised indigenous American agriculture east of the Mississippi at that time. We have the next slide. This is one of my illustrations about the seed head of the flower head of Iva annua. And you'll notice that there are on each side at the top, you see the 2 of the 3 developing female, rather pistillate flowers, and 12 to 16 male pistillate flowers in the center of the head. We really don't know what the plants looked like at the peak of their development. As far as we know, they were grown in a few villages in North Carolina all the way up to about 1800. But for all practical purposes, it became an extinct cultivar, and that no one has seen since. So I think it's fascinating. When I first got into this, I had fantasies of developing this into a modern crop today. The plant does have issues, though, for us in the modern world. Issue number 1 is if you're allergic to the pollen of ragweed, you probably cross-sensitized to be allergic to Iva pollen as well. And also this plant, where the climate suits it perfectly, can become a very aggressive weed. But there are still mysteries about this plant, why it was discontinued. It has the most unusual habit of, when it starts to flower, it does this amazing, I call it a dance, where it waves its branches at night and develops these extensive curls in the habit of the branches that are all gone by sunrise. Yeah, I'm sure that's a very curious thing. It certainly struck me as wonderful. But anyway, thank you so much for having me in this excellent group of discoverers and artists. And I look forward to the rest of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. You know, so much of what you just discussed and what else was discussed throughout, you know, the various lightning talks, in which certainly also holds true for the exhibition, is this idea of, you know, that this relationship between plants and humans as a coevolution together, right? The relationship that goes back, you know, thousands and thousands of years at this point. And that coevolution is something, you know, the influence is almost reciprocal in many ways of humans on plants and plants on humans. And so I want to think a little bit more about the seed in this kind of more moderated part of the conversation. I have a few questions that I'll pose, but I would also be happy to hear from our speakers if you have questions for each other. We often like to talk about cross-pollination in these kinds of formats. If there are questions that you may have for each other, please feel free to also offer those. But to start, I will say that with the seed, you know, is both a literal and figurative archive of information and meaning. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what we can learn from seeds. You know, what lessons do they hold, and what's at risk if we stop listening to them? And because we haven't heard from you, Beatriz, in quite a while now, I'm hoping that maybe you'll start us off.
Sorry, I'm happy to. I would love to talk about what we can learn from seeds, especially from this moment of pandemic, and connect a little bit with what Krista was presenting, that question that she ended with, what will happen if people don't have access to seeds? And I think, you know, one of the issues that I think is important is that one of the things that we have learned from seeds is that they are best preserved when they are planted, that agriculture is the best seed bank that exists. And I'm using that word bank cautiously. And I think the other thing that we could learn from the pandemic is that the people that work in agriculture and that right now are called essential workers are the ones who have died at larger numbers and have been sick at larger rates and are more vulnerable and unprotected by our by our whole system of and lack of insurance, etc. And so I think, you know, one of the questions that for me has become important is the distribution of seeds. How are these seeds going to be distributed in the future, especially as we're all experiencing the madness? I mean, we all have experienced the madness of the distribution of the vaccines as an example of what would happen. And so we have this language in all these banks of, this is the insurance policy of humanity, the botanical garden of the democratic global botanical garden, or, you know, all this language of liberalism. But in practice, we have also seen that the distribution of the vaccines or of the seeds has not been planned properly and has not taken into consideration the distribution of the seeds to the essential workers, which are the people working in agriculture, and especially to the indigenous communities that are paying the burden of this pandemic. So that's like, those are some of my thoughts about this.
Thank you, Beatriz. Yeah, I think it's important to note that, and certainly this is part of my thinking in designing the exhibition, putting the exhibition together. You know, when we talk about agriculture, it is a culture, you know, and within agriculture embedded certain values as a result of that. And so we think about certainly the treatment of workers and the treatment of laborers within agricultural system, that points to larger issues, I think, concerns within that kind of cultural framework that is created around that particular form of production. And Krista, Beatriz, I don't know if you actually, if I ever told you this, but as part of the exhibition, Krista has actually provided a bit of an audio interview for the exhibition, and she talks about your work. So the pairing of your two talks together was somewhat purposeful on my part. But Krista, you know, the fact that you work with seed systems and these kinds of issues, perhaps you might have something more to contribute to what has just been discussed.
I think she said it all. I think it was, I agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment, especially about the distribution of resources and how that limited distribution and sharing of the resources of seed or vaccines or what have you, and how people have been marginalized and excluded from that are major issues in agricultural seeds, in agriculture and in our world. And thinking back also to Peter Carrington's talk or discussion about, you know, these other seeds that were eaten by other people, like there's this incredible cultural heritage in all of the crops that exist today. And we focus on 12 crops in our food systems, essentially. And there's hundreds of them that are out there and that have high protein contents and work in different climates and are incredibly valuable to the culture that has been the stewards of them. Yet they're very ignored, or when they become popular in Western society, they are the people that have been the stewards are often excluded from that process. And so I guess, yeah, there's a lot of pieces to this, but that culture, the knowledge and the information that have been part of seeds in our system, our food systems today are really important in preserving that and making sure that they're not erased by capitalism and those types of frameworks is important work to do.
Truly.
Peter, do you want to offer a comment there?
Well, I mean, modern industrial seed production has invented the idea of a crop who makes seeds you can't use. So you can have to buy from the original factory the seeds that you planted this year if you want to grow that again next year. Capitalism has its ups and downs, but that is certainly one of its most egregious offenses against the history of human beings and plants. And I think anything we can do to arrest that whole notion, the better off we are.
So maybe I'll jump in here with sort of a little bit of different perspective, but if we think about Beal, who was the founder of the seed experiment, the reason why you've got to buy things like corn every year is because it's hybrid seed. And Beal was actually the inventor of hybrid seed originally. And so, I have different perspectives on this. As an evolutionary biologist, I understand why it works so well. If you have two inbred groups and you cross them together, you get this thing called hybrid vigor or heterosis. And you get a much bigger and more resilient hybrid that works much better. But after that generation, it breaks down and it doesn't do as well. And so we kind of have this thing where it's it works really well, but yes, it has this cost that you can't keep the seed around and use it the next generations very easily. And so there's this trade-off. And I guess it's like who has control of the seed is oftentimes how we view that technology or that approach. And so having companies having control of that seed probably has a very different view than like somebody who's like a breeder who works with indigenous communities, for example. And so I would challenge you to say that the technology or the approaches themselves may not be wrong, but it's who is actually in control of the approaches can actually lead to the conflict.
If I could just throw in the idea that when you grow hybrid seed, at least you can grow those seeds. Now, of course, clearly you don't have access to the wonders of whatever hybridization that was scheduled for our benefit in there. And I wasn't actually referring to that intentionally. What I was referring to are these lines of what they call Terminator plants, where you can get no viable seed of any kind if they're doing it properly. And that's not the same as a hybrid not breeding true. That's a whole other matter.
Well, I think of it partly too as an issue of cognitive sovereignty, because seeds are a form of knowledge, and people who plant seeds for millennia have shared seeds and saved seed and traded seeds and circulated seeds. Seeds want to move, and the whole knowledge bank has been moved to the law offices and laboratories of corporations. And it's not just the Terminator or the hybrids, it's intellectual property, which means that even if you can save them and they breed true, you're gonna be prosecuted for doing so. And this is a real threat to seed sovereignty.
Sorry, Krista, I saw your microphone go off. I didn't know if you wanted to say something there.
I couldn't decide. I'll just add, I would say it's not necessarily always the technology. There's definite benefits from those, and certainly in hybrids. I agree with some of the other comments that it is about the intellectual property and the availability and making sure that the genetic diversity remains. It's fine to make hybrids, it's fine to make these other things, but we need all of the genetic diversity that is there. And the way our systems currently work, they narrow it. They keep reducing the availability of the diversity that has been cultivated for thousands of years. And the other piece I wanted to add was I forgot. Never mind.
I would love to add also to the conversation the history of the work that has been done with seeds. I think is really important. I mean, I absolutely not only support science, but collaborate with scientists all the time and learn from scientists and from indigenous communities as well. But I also think it's important to learn from the history of the work that we as a country and as human beings have conducted with seeds as part of capitalism and humanism and liberalism. And I think it's important to understand, for example, the links to eugenics and the links to experimentation with genetics, and how the work with seeds has resulted in the militarization of Central America, for example, and in the waves of immigrants coming this way through the work of the United Fruit Company. And, and if we look at the history of agricultural explorers and how bringing all these plants over here, avocado, oranges, etc., as a way to produce these crops for profit, has impacted all these diversity of seeds that are ancient and that were developed by ancient peoples and are actually really healthy for us, etc. And so I think there's a give and take and a conversation that is really important, in my opinion, to have between sciences and indigenous communities and the history between them.
Thank you for that, Beatriz. I agree with so much of what's being said here, and you know, it's not, I think, without purpose, and meaning that, you know, all of you are also, all of the invited speakers today are also educators, and that's also an important kind of conceit of the exhibition, that in order to confront these issues, many of which have been touched on here, that education is actually one of the key areas of activity that I think, you know, as you pass information and knowledge down from generation to generation. And so thinking a little bit more broadly about these the intersectionality of these issues, the interconnectedness of them, you know, through each of your own work, perhaps there are lessons there or learnings from thinking through the relationship of these kinds of not only seeds, but seeds within the ecosystems and the relationships between these things and relations between each other and different ways of thinking and approaching these topics that somehow influence your teaching and how you approach your role as an educator in the classroom or otherwise. And Dornith, I don't know if you want to have a first shot at that somewhat rambling question.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, about if, but actually, can I follow up on Beatriz's comment? Because, you know, I've really thought a lot about the notion of collecting and making these vaults of seeds around the world, right? And I agree with you, Beatriz. I think that, you know, the connection between the fruit companies and the militarization is undeniable, and it's really, really damaging. But then at the same time, I'm seeing in the present day this race to preserve bananas, you know, just to kind of bring that story forward through, you know, collecting genetic diversity everywhere because they've made them all into clones and, you know, the kind of resulting diaspora. So it's interesting to me to just think about that it started from this really, you know, they're trying to do something good. They're trying to prevent famine. You know, in Vavilov's case, the first comprehensive seed bank in Russia, you know, was really, he made 100 expeditions trying to improve crops to prevent famine. And then, of course, he is killed by Stalin, you know, ironically, as you know, he starves to death in Siberia. So that intertanglement of, you know, people starting with good intentions and then it kind of getting this twisted is so such a powerful story, right? About that's embedded in what we're talking about. So just acknowledge that kind of role of that, you know, that the scientists are really exchanging information, ideas, and as fast as they can to make, you know, the best breeds. And then I agree with the terminal plants are crazy, right? So, and you don't want that getting out into the genetic makeup, right? So risky. But back to teaching and about how this, you know, it's really given me a perspective because of that relationship of conversation and the way that when I'm teaching young artists that, you know, this is totally off topic, how conversations between people with different opinions or different approaches, like scientists and artists, how there's commonality there, but how that leads to unintended and richer outcomes has been the thing that I've taken forward as I've kind of thought about the, you know, the exchange that started in 1493 between East meets West and those kind of complicated economic, you know, exchange of diseases and knowledge and plants, everything else, that is a really mirrors the situation we're in right now. It's like to be careful, but to also listen to as many opinions as you can. So that's just a crazy response on my part. So sorry, just long day of teaching.
Not at all. Claire, I wanted to ask you, I mean, because so much about your writing for Soil Erg and the way that you conceived that project, it's about social work. I mean, in the sense of, you know, people coming together to do the work. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, or perhaps my phrasing is not quite right, but you talk about the kind of the communal, the commonality, the communal nature of the project. You know, what it means for people to come together, and if it's in the case of the soil, spend time in the dirt together, working with the dirt, that there's a kind of community with that, and a sense of kind of, yeah, collaboration of some sort. Perhaps that there's some lesson there, some kind of learning to be gained from that in terms that could be extrapolated into this conversation.
Well, I do think of soil as a social practice because our practices impact, obviously, the quality of our soils, and we haven't considered it as an important part of our cultural, I mean, our common heritage, as valuable, as important as air and water, and maintaining soils. I mean, if we're going to grow things, rather than just make it an extractive practice, we have to give something back to the soil. And, you know, this happens in ecosystems when plants die and when animals defecate. And there are sources of regeneration, of recycling of minerals and nutrients. And it's really an amazing system, because when you think about it, it's like this biosystem catches energy from a star and produces no waste, because everything that might be waste is somebody else's food because of the trophic cascade. But anyway, soil now is something like, one of the things I've been doing is making soil chromatography. And what you discover is that every soil is different. Soil is very local, because it has a history. And so you can make images of soils that indicate their mineral and organic contents and the integration thereof. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm not really talking about education. I'm just talking about soil.
I think it's an important talk about soil, and I would like to put in a vote for rethinking soil as a biome, not just a place.
Totally.
When I started out in entomology, I was working in Thysanura and Diplora, and these, except for the ones who adopt ant colonies as their homes, are generally soil creatures. And when you start to look at things like colembla and mesostigmatic mites and protura and things like these are all whole groups, categories, classes of beings who live exclusively in the soil. And most people couldn't identify a single one as to what group they even belong to, much less to know that we have an entomobreid, a 64th of an inch long, that's brilliant metallic purple, that's common in ours. It's like, you know, if you could make one of these a foot long, everyone would want one as a pet on a leash. You know, they're just beautiful creatures. But, you know, all that soil stuff mostly escapes the notice of the average biped.
Well, it's true. There's a whole cosmos underground, and it has to do with communication and exchange, and it involves many classes of organisms. And Peter, I hope you'll send me one of those 6-foot long purple iridescent creatures.
Yeah, we're working on it in the lab. We're having a little trouble with scaling it up, but
I'm gonna come visit you.
Lovely, absolutely.
I guess in part what I'm after too is like, what, you know, like soil is a form of education. Like the seeds contain knowledge, right? And so, like, what, I don't know, what are there within these things, within seeds, within soil, within these systems, within these, you know, deeply interconnected and interrelated kind of processes? Like, are there lessons within these things that we should be taking greater heed of, or that somehow might, you know, by taking heed of these things now, might change the course that we're on into the future? And I guess, you know, what is our responsibility within that? And perhaps as a kind of final comment before we turn it over to potential questions from the audience. But, you know, just thinking from my own personal experience, like what I've learned from even working in my own garden, understanding that the art, like I agree completely with Beatriz's comment, the garden is this artificial kind of construct, but from having my hands in the soil, I feel like I've learned so much. And even that connection to having to know what soil, good soil and bad soil feels like in my fingers, there's knowledge there, and it kind of creates a relationship that perhaps I wouldn't have otherwise if I didn't have that experience. So, you know, what, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly where I'm going, but are there lessons within that we could learn from seeds, that we can learn from soil, that might help us kind of be a little bit more mindful and conscientious as we kind of continue on this this road as a society or as individuals, that you may want to share with, you know, the people in attendance today or otherwise? I should probably call on someone because in the virtual realm it's a little bit difficult. Doherty, Dornith, go ahead.
Well, you know what I'm interested in is like the resilience. If anything, I've learned about the resilience of, you know, the soil. And I loved, Claire, when you said that there's a whole cosmos underground, because there is so much we don't know, you know, with all the, you know, we're talking about seeds, but of course it's a system. And then the whole new, you know, research being done into plant signaling that is occurring through the soil and with their partners in the fungal realm. It's you know, that builds these, you know, the way that they're helping each other in the forests, and that resilience that's built through a community of plants that we cannot even, we're so blind to. It's really been something that I've been profoundly affected by and think about quite a bit as I encounter plants now since I've been working on this project.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think it's partly the kind of primacy of the visual in our culture, like because you can't see what's going on underground unless you take a soil sample and put it in your microscope, and then it will blow your mind. But I find that my students are, and you know, I teach in a photography department, but I teach students that are doing all kinds of art because our school tries to be interdisciplinary. But the students love to get their hands in the dirt and have tactile experiences and to expand the human sensorium in practice and not, you know, narrow ourselves to what we can see. I'll let someone else.
Well, I would love to add, I think that it's really important what David said at the beginning about the interdisciplinary dialogue that we're having. And also, I mean, the shared knowledge. And I think it's just really important to have the conversations that really can inspire and feed each other. Artists, I mean, scientists are, I love how they're open-minded to having artists around all the time. I mean, there's an artist residency at CERN, at the National Science Foundation has one in Antarctica. I mean, scientists are interested in ideas that artists might have and vice versa. And I think also listening to the shared knowledge of indigenous communities can really bounce off each other and help us move forward. and move towards that race that Dornith is mentioning about, trying to preserve as many of these diverse seeds in the world, etc. But I think also the knowledge of saying the way we're consuming all this power cannot be, and if it is, we have to switch to this plant, as David was saying. I mean, those kinds of things could give us a little time for us to have these conversations. But I think the conversations are urgent, and I really appreciate us having this conversation.
Thank you, Beatriz. That was also on my kind of list of topics. I was going to be a little bit more polarizing and poke a little bit about, oftentimes in these situations, thinking about bringing artists and scientists together, there's a lot of opportunity to find commonality. I'm also interested in the limits of artistic work or scientific work, like where do they also diverge? But maybe that's too much to take on at this particular juncture in the evening. There is a question in the chat. Katie is asking to learn a little bit more about about the knowledge that we can glean from the Beal experiment. What has the experiment taught us over the years about plants, about how we study and learn about them? David, I think you're the obvious candidate to take the lead on that.
Sure. So the Beal seed experiment is a really simple question, and the question is, how long can different types of seeds live in the soil? And the reason why the bottle is open is because it's being open to elements. Moisture can come in and out of that bottle, and we want to know, like, how long in sort of a natural condition could a seed last? We know that some seeds can last much longer than the ones that are in this bottle if you keep them under the right conditions, but that wasn't the question here. And so by digging it up ever so often, we can find out which ones can live the longest and how long they can live. Originally, Beal only intended the experiment to last 100 years. So it was dug up every 5 years. And then there was more and more things that kept coming up. And so they decided to stretch it to 10 years. And now we've stretched it to 20 years. And so there's 4 bottles left, and it should go to the year 2100 at this point, when the final bottle will be dug up. And so it's very simple in question. And I've known about the experiment for about 20 years myself. When it was last dug up, I heard about it when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. And I was excited about that. And then when we got closer and closer to this, I sort of was like, is anybody going to care about this thing? Because I had sort of lost the magic of this simple experiment. And then when we started telling people that we had dug it up, the reaction was just so overwhelming, because I think it's how it's cloaked in mystery, and also because it's so simple, and the forethought of Beal to plan an experiment that'd be around well after he died is really magical in some ways. So it kind of, it's a special thing, and seeing the reaction by the media to it has been like, wow, it is a cool thing. And I sort of felt what I felt when I was probably about 20 years old and first learned about this thing in the first place.
And from the statistics department, as I understand it, it's the longest running scientific experiment on this planet that we know of. If I'm correct, I don't know.
There's a couple experiments that are a little bit longer, like a Parkes grass experiment in England. But in terms of botanical experiments specifically, yeah, this is the longest one in the world.
Thank you.
But I think overall, this being on this panel has been great to see all the different opinions, and it got me thinking about things I haven't thought about for a long time, especially thinking about soil itself. And I guess I have one question for everyone. It's kind of a weird question, but it's do you know the taste of the soil from where you grew up? So for myself, when I grew up around redwood forest in Northern California, and I know that taste, and when I go home, I sample that soil, and you can taste it and you feel part of the place. And so I do think it's a very powerful thing. It's kind of, I turn off my logical and skeptical brain and sort of embrace that. And I think that's sort of the difficulty for us scientists is we have to, I think sometimes we have to balance those things out and figure out like when we should stop being skeptical and just kind of open ourselves to other things as well.
Excellent point.
That I just want to add to that and link back to Stephen's question as well, and thinking about how art can influence science and vice versa. And I'd like, since we're in Seeds of Resistance, I'll push a little on the idea of what science is and who defines science. And if we allow the perspective, so the way that Western science constructs questions and research is almost immediately limits the alternative perspectives and types of things we can learn from those questions. And so by expanding our horizons and sharing knowledge with different communities and indigenous communities and our artists and everything enables us to ask new questions and expand that our knowledge base and vision for what is science and what matters. Yeah.
I would love to add to what Krista was saying and also to Stephen's question, because I think it is important and it is our responsibility to deconstruct contemporary modern disciplines, including science, because scientific work has been done since ancient times. And ancient peoples in the Americas, not far from where I grew up, were scientists. And the longest experiments that have been carried out were started by them. And so I think it's important to recognize that. But at the same time, I think it's important for us in the 21st century to question disciplinarian, let's call it boundaries or maybe diagrams. And I think what's really important is the interdisciplinariness of, the not respecting borders and this porousness of the work that we do. And so instead of answering what are the limits of art and science, I want to say that I don't really believe in that it's necessarily different to do art or science. Maybe there's that different objective, but I think there's a lot that can be shared. And in the Beal experiment, I see a lot of parallels with ancient indigenous people's, their ideas about intergenerational care, or their ideas about gifts of generosity that you give to others that you will never meet. I mean, being part of the Beal experiment and hearing David say, this is going to end in the year 2100 makes me think, well, maybe, possibly, we're not going to be there. And there's something beautiful about sending a gift to the future others that we will never meet, and all those things are things that enter in conversation with what ancient peoples did. And I think it becomes really beautiful to find those points of coincidence where we are actually working within a discipline, but also stepping outside of it and working in other logics too.
Yeah, that's great, Beatriz. I love that idea of giving a gift to people you never will meet because you'll be dead. But and feeding the soil, hopefully. But I've been thinking a lot about how much science, both science and art, are changing. They are not static because they're cultural practices. And I think science, in my observation, is responding to a lot of the critiques that are coming out of the cultural realm. And I mean, just listen to Krista. It's like science is not in a vacuum. Science is part of society, and because of the urgency of our biosystems collapse that we're looking at because of climate change and warming of oceans, et cetera, scientists are having to become more politicized. at least a lot of the scientists that I've talked to, whereas traditionally that's kind of been off limits for scientists. So, I mean, that's just, and artists too are changing because, it's not the autonomous object in a museum anymore. It's much more emphasis on interactive practices, transdisciplinary viewpoints, and transcultural viewpoints.
I echo so much of that sentiment. I actually believe that artists and scientists, to even kind of continue to use those labels, almost seems somewhat irrelevant, but regardless, they're a part of the same project. And at the museum, within the exhibition, of course, we have the artwork on view as part of that in the galleries, but it was important to me to bring the voices of David, other colleagues. Certainly Krista is there as well. Peter's voice is represented within the brochure that accompanies the exhibition. Those voices are in the gallery with the artist, and so in that sense, defining what is art and what is not art, and what is science and what is science, and where those things belong is actually increasingly kind of uninteresting to me. And why not put all of those things in the museum together and see what conversation emerges? So I want to make sure that we also, I really do not want to shut this conversation off in any way, but I'm also cognizant of the time where we're at this evening. And I want to make sure that if anyone has, from the audience, if there's any, questions that you want to ask our participants or in general, carve out a little bit of time for that before we cap this wonderful evening. And if there are none, that's also okay. Okay. Well, on that note then, two quick plugs. One, because it's related to this last part of this conversation, one of the books that was very influential to me, as I was kind of thinking and otherwise putting together this organization or exhibition, was a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass, which I would highly recommend. She describes herself as a Anishinaabeg scientist, so very much weaving together indigenous wisdom and scientific inquiry. And so I've certainly learned a lot from that book. Vandana Shiva, I'm glad that you included that image, Claire, because her work, and I think she's coming out with understand the movie soon. Her work was very much influential to me as well. And finally, tomorrow is Earth Day, and Dornith Doherty is going to be back with the museum tomorrow evening on Instagram, on our Instagram live conversation series with our studio educator, Britta Ernest, at 8 p.m. Eastern time. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's right. So please tune in to our Instagram channel to hear more from Dornith, do a little studio visit with her. And ultimately, I cannot thank you all enough, all of our invited speakers. Thank you for joining me this evening, joining all of us, sharing your ideas and your thoughts. I felt like perhaps I should just get out of the way and let you all talk, because you guys had so much to say to each other. And yeah, so much wonderful ideas and content. So thank you. Thank you for everything.